Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy, and welcome to our event today. I want to thank you for joining us. And in fact, this is our last event of the year. So I want to thank you for all your attendance, support, activity with our program this year, and be on the lookout because beginning of January, we launch into a very robust and really interesting set of programs starting in 2022. I also want to make sure to call your attention to the questions tab on your right dashboard. If you have questions, we will get to as many questions as we can toward the end of the conversation. We have a terrific panel, which we're going to turn things over to in a minute. And if you have questions for them, please type them in and we will get to as many as we can. I also want to especially thank our supporters, sponsors, partners. They are committed, as I know everyone on the call is, to having serious and insightful discussions about these critical issues that are of core interest to all of us. So I want to thank all of our partners for their support. I particularly want to thank our co-host today, the law firm of Schiff Hardin. And what I'm going to do now is turn things over to Sarah Fitz, partner at Schiff Hardin, who advises, represents clients on all kinds of energy and infrastructure issues. She's the co-chair of the Power Law Committee of the International Bar Association. She's on the board of the Regional Planning Association. I could go on, but I think instead I'm going to turn it over to Sarah so we can get to our discussion today. Sarah?
Hi, thank you, and welcome to Our Energy Policies webinar. My name is Sarah Fitz, and as was said, I am a corporate energy and infrastructure partner at Schiff Hardin. I'm also a board member of Our Energy Policy. Schiff Hardin is proud to support the OEP in this webinar series. We're a national law firm with a strong energy and environmental practice. And earlier this month, we announced our merger with Aaron Fox, effective March 1, 2022. This merger will give us added strength in the automotive and transportation industries. Today's webinar focuses on the timely topic of electric vehicles, how to buy them, get them charged, and the various policies supporting or perhaps hindering their development. The evolution of the U.S. transportation fuel of choice from oil to electrons could profoundly change our transportation system, of course, but could also have profound effects on how we live and the businesses that thrive in the future. It is my pleasure at this point to introduce our moderator, Dan Levy. Dan Levy is the director at Credit Suisse, serving as the energy research analyst for the U.S. auto and auto parts sector. Prior to joining Credit Suisse in 2018, Dan spent 7 years at Barclays as part of the U.S. Autos Equity Research Team. He has also worked at UBS in equity capital markets and at Morgan Stanley in private wealth management. Thank you, Dan.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And very, very pleased to be joining this forum today and moderating this discussion. Very topical. Just by way of background, I lead the equity research, the autos equity research group at Credit Suisse. And so my focus is across the automotive supply chain. And obviously, when we think about autos today, the predominant topic is electrification. So very timely, and given the actions by automakers, the entire supply chain, and certainly the government, this should be a very timely discussion. I'm going to introduce the panel. We have a great panel presenting today, and we'll do a series of discussion for the next, call it 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for audience questions. I'm pleased to introduce the panel today. First up, we have Stephen Boyd. Steve is the Batteries and Electrification Program Manager within the Department of Energy's Vehicle Technology Office. Steve maintains the office's portfolio of research projects for batteries and electric drive technologies, along with grid and charging impacts for electric vehicles. Next up, we have Colleen Jansen. Colleen is the Chief Marketing Officer for ChargePoint, where she oversees brand communications, demand generation, consumer engagement, and customer marketing. Prior to joining ChargePoint, she led marketing disciplines for a number of categories, creating startups as well as established brands, Microsoft, Yahoo, Intuit, LinkedIn, You'll note ChargePoint is one of the many new entrants in the new mobility space, really focused on charging, which is a very critical aspect of electrification. And lastly, we have Michael Mayton. Mike is the Senior Strategist for EV and Energy Policy with General Motors, where among other responsibilities, he's led the advanced planning effort for GM's next generation of battery electric vehicles. He's also the architect of GM's National Zero Emission Vehicle Program. So you note we have a pretty wide set of panel touching on startups, legacy auto, and then also the government. These are all key stakeholders that will really play a role in unlocking EV penetration. So with that, I'll kick it off. And I think the big question here is, we know that President Biden back in August released a target in which he's targeting by 2030, more than 50% of new vehicle sales are going to be EV. Just by way of context, right now it's only 3%. You know, in the U.S. right now, we know that Tesla is the primary EV player, with roughly 60% of shares. So we're talking about a very big shift ahead. So I think the question is, there's a lot that needs to be done to unpack this shift to EV, going from, call it 3% to 50%. So what's it going to take? Mike, why don't we start with you? What's it going to take to drive this shift to EV?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thanks to the folks at Our Energy Policy for having me. So, as you indicated, 50% is an ambitious goal, and what 50% of new auto vehicle sales means is this is a nationwide rollout. This isn't something that can exist, on the coast and largely in California. This is something that's going to have to a fundamental shift in our transportation nationwide, and I think it's going to take effort on all parts. The automakers, General Motors, we signaled our intent to meet that goal. Our plans are in process right now to meet that goal. So the vehicles are going to be there, but the infrastructure needs to be there. And frankly, to your other point, the supply chain needs to be there. So it really is a national effort, kind of everybody rowing in the same direction to meet this really ambitious goal. Cars and trucks play a variety of different roles in personal and goods transportation today. Battery electrics are going to have to satisfy all those different utility roles. So I'm going to really take, kind of all hands on deck to affect that transition and meet those ambitious goals.
Colleen, what's it going to take to drive this shift? Yeah.
Yeah, so I would underscore Michael's comments that, really this does start with the vehicles, right? You need wide availability of vehicles in all form factors for both passenger cars and fleets. So when your city bus rolls up and that's electric, as well as the pickup truck that you drive for work, or the luxury vehicle that you enjoy taking road trips with, wide availability of vehicles in all form factors, I think, is really essential. And really the build out of charging goes hand in hand with that, right? You have to have charging that is built out where people live, work, and play. And, charging and fueling looks different than the old way of fueling, right? These are not necessarily all going to be conspicuous corner fueling stations. Charging is going to be integrated to where people spend time. So for the majority of us, that's where we sleep and where we work. So that's a lot of home and work fueling, and that's a change. That's a shift from making fueling a separate stop to actually fueling while you're doing something else. And so I really think it's a combination of wide availability of vehicles and then charging integrated to how people live.
Great. Steve?
Yeah, and I think a key part of this, right, is some of the supporting sort of infrastructure and investments that are going to be required. This is a big shift, right, in terms of the transportation fabric. And so I know we're really involved in trying to roll out some of the bipartisan infrastructure legislation supporting investments for both battery supply chain work. So this is including some of the critical materials for batteries, such as lithium and cobalt and nickel, right? That also includes investments for battery recycling and standing up some of the sort of necessary value chain elements that are required in order to have this really broad electrification and transportation. And that's in addition to some of the both upgrades on the utility side, but also some of them supporting investments needed for infrastructure to allow for vehicle charging, including some of the more expansion of charging for folks at home, maybe who don't have a garage, right? So for multi-unit dwellings or publicly accessible charging, as well as some of the investments that the federal government and states are maybe in a better position to make, such as rest stops or highway right-of-way sort of access.
Yeah. So I think tying it all together, I mean, the answer is it's going to take, a lot of things have to come together to drive this change, between having the vehicle availability, transforming the supply chain, the charging network. There is a lot that needs to come together. And the way I tell it to people is, I know a lot of it isn't there right now, but the people who see this 50% number as possible, even though we're only at 3% today, is you believe all of these things will come together in the coming years. Okay, so I think that's a great start. Next question that I have to everyone, and the name of this group is Our Energy Policy, so let's emphasize the word policy. If we look at China, Europe, we see EV penetration much higher there, and we see that part of that higher EV penetration really comes from policies or government involvement that are driving penetration. I think the best example is Norway. Today in Norway, it's call it like 70 or 75% of new vehicles sold are EVs, and that's because they've had for a number of years a very proactive approach on EV policy. We know that that the Biden administration is taking a much more proactive or aggressive approach on EV policy versus what we've seen in prior administrations. We know there are a number of tools in that policy toolbox. So my question to the group is, as we think through those policy tools, through CAFE standards, through subsidies, through charging investments, what is going to be the most impactful policy that is going to drive uptake over the years ahead? Why don't we start? We'll go reverse. Steve, go ahead.
Sure. So I'll start by not answering the question, which is we don't do a whole lot of policy in DOE, especially in our organization in vehicle technologies. We're primarily led by sort of like R&D directions in these areas. But that being said, as you can understand, the sort of roadmap in the game has really changed pretty quickly from a lot of promising research to what people are trying to make plans on, right? And so many folks are sort of reaching out and looking for the right kind of data and technical guidance that can inform these sort of future policies that you're talking about, right? And a lot of those discussions for us have focused a bit on the sort of technology trajectory in terms of performance and cost reduction. A lot of that focused on batteries, right? And so we see, a few different things that have a high likelihood in terms of battery cost and getting down to what we had pegged as something like $100 per kilowatt hour. By 2030, we actually see that happening a bit sooner, maybe even in the 2025 sort of time frame, and recently updated our target to get down to something like $60 per kilowatt hour at the cell level for batteries. And we're trying to push that by 2030. That may require some advances in terms of the technology, but these are the sort of developments that can help inform some of these policies as you're talking about. And that's in addition to what we can do in terms of supporting things on the grid side, and whether that's incorporating technological advancements or some of the planning tools that we've developed to try to help some either localities and or utilities kind of make informed investments and try to support these kinds of really big changes and big plans they have for their investments in charging.
Great. Mike, go ahead.
Sure. Well, great summary. And the way we think about it is good policy should really, for a change this large, again, across the whole transportation fabric, you really have to look at both the supply side and the demand side of the equation. So on the supply side, you have things like, like regulation, but you also have supply chain policy to make sure, and I know we'll talk about that probably a little later, but policies around the EV supply chain, policies around battery research. Steve is exactly right. Let's remember, $100 a kilowatt hour is, for a larger vehicle, is still about $10,000 worth of battery for 300 miles. So we have to get to cost levels that are much lower, because we feel that 300-mile threshold for U.S. consumers at least is a big deal, And then when we talk about the demand side, because of the cost equation right now, we feel incentives are still a big part of the equation. As you mentioned, Norway incentives have proved a large lift, not only in Norway, but in the big spike in EU uptake, as well as in China. So we know incentives can stimulate demand. The infrastructure policies around infrastructure rollout, and I should say, it's not just about installing that infrastructure. There's an operational component that needs to be considered as well. So, currently the scale just doesn't exist yet for operators to make sure that uptime is critical. And again, to roll out to 50%, to give customers, potential EV customers, the comfort that they're going to be able to get a charge, that charger is going to be working. We need policies around that. And it's not just DC fast charging, it's things like Stephen pointed out, multi-dwelling units, and things like this. So we tend to look at it, you need matching policies on kind of the supply and the demand side. And when I say demand side, not just, as we talked about, not just for kind of personal transportation, but goods delivery as well as public transportation. So kind of across the board, I think, and I think just as a final note, I think, the bipartisan infrastructure bill combined with what we're seeing in Build Back Better is really a great start at kind of a suite of policies that are going to help build that scale for the industry.
Great. Colleen, and I'll make one add-on to your question is, there's a $7.5 billion figure out there. Is that enough for EV to fund EV charging infrastructure?
Yep. Well, and as Michael pointed out, there's, the infrastructure bill does afford a fair amount for charging adjacent to highway. And we know that that's really important for connecting rural communities. But we also know that multifamily and fleet charging is particularly important. So those dimensions included in Build Back Better are really essential. So on the policy front, we think that, continuing to address things like demand charges, encouraging new ZEV mandates and goals, all important to reducing barriers to charging deployment, including the policy work around construction and permitting and passing EV ready building codes. But really for, one of the things that we're focused on at ChargePoint is ensuring that the build out of public and private charging across the country can be supported by clean fuel standards. So we advocate for states to establish clean fuels programs. So those programs exist today in California and Oregon and BC. But we also encourage the federal government to consider the creation of a national clean fuel standard. We think that this can help drive innovation around the commercialization of new low carbon fueling technologies, and can also promote local economic development. So we think that there's potentially, you know, a lot of scale in a national standard around that, in addition to all the other policy that's probably familiar to your audience today.
Colleen, I'll tack on one more to that, which I think you raise an interesting point. If we're going to really decarbonize, we have to think about the energy source. So how much does the government need to think through, whether it's state or federal, the underlying power sources, and how much work needs to be done on the grid to support true decarbonization? It's not just about turning over the fleet. We also need sustainable energy sources. How are you thinking about that?
Yep, so we partner very closely with utilities all across North America and Europe, and you know, we do everything from enable them to pilot home charging programs to helping their commercial customers manage power at the site, integrating in their EV charging programs into building management and power management solutions. So, you know, that does tend to be a very hyper localized need in terms of what's going on at the site and with the given utility territory. Our model is we're selling charging solutions to site hosts. So whoever is their local provider is who we're partnering with to enable power management at the site.
Great.
I'll tack on just a little bit. Sorry, just a little bit to that, which is, you know, we started off and said, right, this is a sort of big community kind of problem, and so we'll just tack on utilities to that too, right? Like it is a lot of folks can be invested by this sort of a change, or affected by this sort of a change. And so we're definitely, you know, having some of those conversations as well. And, you know, some utilities have been really proactive in terms of both adopting EV charging, but also working to sort of integrate this into sort of their operations and their understanding. We're also really promised in terms of generation, right, by the uptick in renewables and the investment that we've seen there that's only been growing, in addition to the sort of grid storage elements that you mentioned that are often complementary to sort of providing, you know, the sort of guaranteed power and reliability that folks expect from the grid.
Great. Steve, I actually want to follow up on some of your prior comments. You're focused on, you know, the government, you're focused on government efforts in terms of developing technologies, but also thinking through the supply chain. So a two-part question for you. First, you know, we know that EVs, you know, from a supply chain perspective is very regionally focused. We know that a lot of the battery technology, a lot of the battery materials, you know, it's primarily coming from Asia. So what are the steps that can be taken to really fully localize, you know, the different steps of the supply chain? You know, and then who is taking the lead on this? Is this something that government needs to take the lead on, or is this something that should be done by the corporates, or is it both?
Sure. So I think that was a two-part question, but they're a little bit similar, or a little bit overlapping, right? We're, you know, how do I want to say this? We're not involved in the supply chain directly, right? You know, primarily, as I mentioned, we're a research organization. But that said, we've tried to do a lot of work, especially recently in listening and understanding exactly what the supply chain looks like now and what's going to be required just to, you know, really do this sort of a massive change and scale up in terms of the U.S. battery industry. And so I'll put in a short plug if folks are familiar or curious. You can look at a couple different reports that we've sort of worked on firsthand. One of those from the Federal Consortium for Advanced Batteries. They have a lithium-ion battery roadmap, which is that's an organization kind of spearheaded by DOE, but with broad government support specific to lithium-ion battery technology and a lot of the different elements that you know, we think kind of need to fall into place in order to support this type of domestic industry and the supply needed for electric vehicles. In addition to that, there was an executive order for critical material supply chains, and there was a number of different ones indicated in that report. I think there were 4 different areas, and batteries was one of these. And so there's also a 100-day report that came out of that executive order, and I believe that was released in like May or June of this past year. And it covers some of the similar sort of points that you're making here. So I definitely can't cover all that during the panel here. There's a lot of really smart folks that are working very deeply in that. But to answer your question, in brief, there are a number of different actions that we think the government can inform and even make some investments in, that we're starting to plan out, and we want to be strategic and sort of judicious in the types of investments we're making that can support the development and a kind of robust domestic industry for batteries and battery materials, battery manufacturing. I mentioned battery recycling as well. These are all, I think, elements that need to happen. And I think there is probably a proper role for government in some of these. But I also mentioned, we're continuing to see really excellent announcements from the private industry, and that's not just cell manufacturing, right? We're seeing a number of these that are focused on some of the necessary supply chain elements, including materials and cathodes and anodes to support this type of high volume battery manufacturing. And so again, it's a large community that really needs to exist in order to make a robust domestic supply chain happen. But I think we're starting to see some bits and pieces of that, and we've put out some material that might be helpful in terms of showing exactly what our position is and what we think needs to happen to try to get that into place.
Great. Now let me follow up on that, and this is something for you, Mike, that you may want to comment as well, given GM's efforts in batteries. So you're doing a lot of work in battery. We know there's a lot of battery technologies out there. So if you could just give us a sense of, I think the common chemistry today is NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt. We know that there are other opportunities as well, Tesla going to 4680 cells. We hear about work in solid state. And then we also hear about something like LFP, lithium iron phosphate, which is primarily in China, low energy density, but much lower cost, that is being embraced more widely. So maybe you could just give us like a very quick battery snapshot of what the prevalent technologies might be. And also, where are we in battery cost today? And I think you said by 2025 or 2030, you said we'll be down to $60 on the cell level. So just a snapshot of the dominant battery technologies that you expect to emerge, and then something I think, Mike, you should comment on that as well, please.
Sure. Just to help Stephen out, it's called a battery blueprint. Was what the paper that the DOE it's actually a really good paper put out in May about attracting domestic manufacturing. So our interest in the supply chain and then the chemistries. Just before I get into the chemistries, we've announced 4 battery cell manufacturing plants in the U.S. We've announced location to 2 of those, and as Stephen pointed out, I think you're referring to our announcement last week with POSCO, a cathode active material manufacturer. So now that we have the cell plants existing or will exist in the U.S., it's all about moving upstream, right? Because right now, all of those materials still, frankly, flow out of Asia, largely out of China. So bringing the cathode active material, the anodes, and then, eventually going further up the supply chain is really critical for a couple reasons. It's critical to bring our costs down. It's also critical to have visibility from a sustainability perspective. And, sustainability is one of our pillars, and we want to make sure that whatever we're building, it's secure and it's sustainable, as well as scalable and cost competitive. But the way to do that is to bring it here to North America and potentially to the US. And we look forward to working with the DOE, with some of the funds that became available with the infrastructure framework in Build Back Better. But Dan, your question, I'm sorry, was about technology. So yeah, you're right. NMC 811 is the dominant technology right now. you know, I shouldn't say foreseeable future, but for the next several years, call it Gen 3 chemistries. General Motors, as well as the entire industry, is obviously looking to bring costs down, to bring energy density up, you know, to make sure that the durability, of course, and safety, those are both paramount to the research. So solid state is in play, lithium metal anodes, right, are in play, or silicon dominant anodes, maybe in a little shorter time frame. You know, right now we don't see a role for LFP very large in North America, and it's largely due to that range requirement that we feel customers in North America need. But again, that could potentially change. So I think we're still, you know, looking at least for this foreseeable future at high nickel content. We're probably always going to need lithium. We're probably always going to need nickel. Getting out of cobalt is a you know, a priority, I think, for the industry at some point, and that brings kind of some of the issues to bear, where we're trying to build the supply chain at a time when the chemistry and the technology is evolving so quickly. Just a few years ago, we were asking all of our lithium providers to produce lithium carbonate, because that was what was going into the NMC, the older generation NMC cells. We've now said, no, we don't need lithium carbonate, we need lithium hydroxide. That's not a massive change, but it's just an example of the types of changes that we're probably going to continue to see as we're on the, you know, kind of the bleeding edge of energy density and cost. You know, in terms of $60 per kilowatt hour to cell level by 2030, that's consistent with some of the other third-party estimates we've seen, and I would say that gets us closer to this cost parity paradigm, you know, that we all desire.
And current cell costs today, when we're talking on a cell basis, it's probably, call it 100 with packs at like 150, give or take.
Yeah, well, you have to be careful to understand, are we talking LFP or NMC 811? And you know, sound bites never quite make that distinction, but yeah, that's in the realm of the cost situation right now for I'll call it for US or North America cells that go into North American products.
Right.
Yeah, I'll just insert there that I think recently Bloomberg said for 2021, they said $131 per kilowatt hour, and I believe our sort of annual update for production cost would be 132. So you can, that's per kilowatt hour on a cell basis, and that's just rated cell. It's not usable cell, and it's also not a pack. So there's a lot of different ways to chop it, but that's where I would put it right now.
Colleen, let's unpack the charging side a little more. So first of all, maybe you could, you know, just give a quick, you know, overview to the audience of ChargePoint's role. You know, there's many different players in the charging industry, so where you sit in the value chain. And then my second question is, you know, when we think about charging, you know, the U.S. is a big place. We could try to take a federal, you know, a national approach. But what we also see is that there's probably more of a local or regional type approach. There are different corridors. So how are you approaching this? Is there a national solution, or is the solution more you're focused on each, you know, state or each municipality or each region and sort of picking away bit by bit?
Sure. So just in terms of the context for ChargePoint within the ecosystem, so ChargePoint is in all categories of charging. So if you're going to move a person or a package around the planet, we want to help fuel that. So that could be electrifying ports, it could be transit depots, it could be workplaces, medical plazas, recreation centers, retail, as well as residential charging, whether that's in a multifamily dwelling situation or a single family home. So broadly, you know, we see it as our mission to help quicken the pace of electrification by enabling charging in all the places where people spend time. And in terms of, what it's going to take to, continue this momentum is, we really think the full ecosystem of charging needs to be built out. So the, charging along highways is really beneficial. That's going to connect, to your point, to your question about geographies, that's really going to connect rural communities to one another and enable long distance travel. So think about charging along the highways being, in addition to traditional fueling centers and convenience retail, think also locations with amenities and recreation. And we know that that's very important to enable those long distance road trips, but also to connect rural communities. So the whole country stands to benefit from the charging adjacent to highways. But as I mentioned earlier, we think, with the majority of fueling happening at home and at work, we really need to address multifamily, and we need to enable fleet electrification as well. So there are geographic benefits certainly to electrifying highway locations, but also, charging needs to be widely available, and it needs to be matched to the natural dwell time of the parking. We all know these stats, right? 96% of the time a passenger vehicle is not moving anyone around. That parked time frame gives a lot of opportunity for charging. In the case of a work vehicle, it's a little bit different. But for us, it's really about, in addition to just ensuring that people have the incentives to move to electric mobility, that the charging solutions are built out in all locations. And, it could be any parking lot, any depot, any place that vehicles spend time.
And thank you. And maybe you can remind us, because we see different stakeholders trying to play a role in charging. We obviously see, state funding on this. We see utilities. I think there was, there are regional and national coalitions. Automakers, Mike's parent company is doing some work on the charging side. So, maybe you could just give us a sense of like how all the different stakeholders come together, or is this, you're just sort of addressing bit by bit, and it's a group effort across many different stakeholders.
Yep. Well, what we see is that the charging solutions naturally follow the vehicles that hit the road, whether those are fleet vehicles or passenger vehicles. So the charging, if you were to look at, ChargePoint got its start in 2007. If you were to look at our port count and how it's grown over time, you would see that it maps in a very consistent fashion with the number of vehicles hitting the road. And so, it all starts with the vehicles, and we need, we're partnering with everyone, automakers, other charging networks, the utilities, the policy influencers to enable all of that build out. And one of the things that I think has been fantastic to see in recent years is just the cooperation among the charging networks. Now, roaming enables drivers to, use stations from other networks, even if they don't have an account. And, that's something that we've put a lot of software and R&D into. Again, I think another example of the ecosystem really working together in a cooperative fashion to make sure that this is a great experience, right? We're often, working with automakers to ensure that charging feels ubiquitous, right? You get behind the wheel of your EV and you see charging integrated into your in-dash system. You see it populate in Google Maps and other popular consumer platforms, being able to start a charging session with my smartwatch, or being able to tap my phone to charge a session and not have to scramble for an RFID card, being able to roam across stations. These are all things that the ecosystem is enabling, the charging networks working with one another, the charging companies integrating with the automakers, being able to pull up my app and make sure that my local utility plan is integrated into my home charger so that I'm charging at the most efficient rate. Those are all examples of the ecosystem coming together to enable a great EV charging experience and ownership experience.
Great. I know we're running up on time before we go to the group session, so I want to go to Mike. I think you can give us the perspective of the automakers, because we know that to enable this there needs to be product. I think your boss has said that the shift that's underway, for the industry and at General Motors is the largest shift in the 100-year history of the auto industry. We know that there's a lot of plans out there. We've seen the product plans, we've seen the targets, your 2035 target to be 100% battery electric. But we also know that right now your dominant product today is ICE. In fact, it's roughly 99% of your sales. We know that trucks are still the moneymaker for your company. So maybe you could give us a sense of how the different pieces of the transition are coming together at GM. How your company is handling this this once in a lifetime shift.
Yeah, you're right, and Mary did say that it's frankly the largest transformation we've ever seen, and it's a transformation in every part of our business. There's not a part that isn't affected by that. So we've announced 20 models in the US, 30 models globally by 2025, and as you said, our target of 100% EVs by 2035. So there isn't, like I said, there isn't a part of our business that isn't affected. Our factory zero. So we just our Detroit Hamtramck facility, which will start producing Hummer EVs yet this year, is going to only produce electric vehicles. Our plant in Spring Hill, Tennessee is going to produce a combination of electric and ICEs until at the point where we get sufficient scale to produce only EVs. I already mentioned the battery plants. I think a couple just pillars of our transformation, if I can mention, it's how do we make this sustainable? Right? How do we make sure, again, speaking to that supply chain, but also how do we bring our entire workforce along? That's a commitment we've made. This is a change from making engines and transmissions to making batteries and drive units. And we're in the midst of that change and trying to basically determine the best way. But we feel the best way to do that is to get to scale quickly. The best way to bring costs down across the supply chain is to get to scale quickly. And that's why we focus only on battery electric vehicles, to try and affect that change as quickly as we can, to get to that next chemistry, to get to that next cost level, or that next energy density level. We will be we also have to consider, as you said, our profits right now come from full-size trucks. You've seen we're coming out with the Silverado EV in just a couple of years. We expect that to sell very well to our customers, that are looking for the utility there. But we need, again, the rest of the rest of kind of the market to come along with us. We need that infrastructure there. We need the supply chain, the help on the supply chain and building that out in the US. So, you're right. It's absolutely the largest change we've ever experienced in the auto industry, but we're committed to it. And we think we're taking the necessary steps. There's just it's hard to keep up with the announcements we're making to affect this change, but it's a really exciting time to work at General Motors.
Great. I'll ask one more to the group as a whole before we turn it over to audience questions. And I think we've unpacked a lot. There's a lot of different components that need to come together to enable this transition. We've talked about a lot on the supply side. I want to ask about the consumer, because when we think about the consumer side of it, we also know, I mentioned earlier, US, only 3% EV penetration. That's below what we're seeing in places like Europe and China, where it's closer to 12, 13% and inflecting much higher. Obviously, they have more aggressive government policies, but there's also a different consumer dynamic. We know in the US, gas is cheaper. We know in the US, we like our SUVs and our trucks more. These are segments that may take a little longer to electrify. So the question is this: do we wait for the consumer to embrace EV, or do we take the consumer along with us and push the consumer to EV? Mike, why don't you start with this, because I think you're going to have some insights on this. Go ahead.
No, it's a great question. I think it's a little bit of both. We feel our dealers are a key asset in this whole equation in terms of educating consumers that they're the face of our brands. We think they can be play a key role. But as Colleen said, the products have to be there too. The trucks and the utilities. I think there's certain policies that can kind of push consumers over the edge. That government, that incentive, right? That state or federal incentive, it can be that whether it's for the vehicle or frankly whether it's for installation of a charger at home, can be that final step in convincing customers I have the confidence that this is going to meet my needs and I can get it for a reasonable price, and I'm not going to have to change my lifestyle to adopt this. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. It's OEMs coming out with kind of this full range of products for all all Americans, but also some policies that can maybe push over the edge. One thing I even on the infrastructure side, I'll just give you an example. Installing the infrastructure is important, but a simple thing like signage, making people aware of where charging is. So even when they're, the vehicle purchase process starts the minute you purchase your previous vehicle and you start thinking about all the things you want in your next one. And if you're constantly passing signs for, oh, this McDonald's has EV charging, or this hotel has EV charging, or oh, there's EV charging at that rest area, you build up this confidence that it's available. So a simple thing like signage is frankly a big step in growing that consumer awareness and confidence that they can live with an EV.
Great. Steve,
I think that's exactly right. It's, how do you, if you're going to ask people to make a change and drive a different way, fuel a different way, you have to make it really easy. And I think, all of Mike's points are great, around wayfinding. There needs to feel like there's charging where you are spending your time. And we all have 100 years of driving around, over 100 years of driving around until the little yellow light comes on, right? And pulling over and making a separate stop. When people ask me, oh, Colleen, you've been driving electric since 2011. How long does it take you to fuel up? And I say, oh, well, it's 4 seconds. And they say, really, 4 seconds? Like, what about if your battery's completely empty? And I'm like, well, that's just how long it takes me to plug in. It doesn't matter if my battery's empty or if I'm just topping up. So I think that notion of helping to educate consumers about what this looks like so that the change does not feel significant. One of the first principles in marketing is don't ask people to change their behavior because they don't like change. And I've only met one person in my 10 years of driving electric who has had a BEV and gone the other direction and gone back to a ICE vehicle. And it was simply because there wasn't enough range, and a lot has changed in 10 years. So the market's overwhelmingly moving to big battery BEVs. The charging infrastructure is getting built out, but we do need awareness and education to help people understand that the new way of fueling is going to look a little bit different, and it's actually going to be more convenient for you. It's going to be you're going to be charging while you're doing something else, just like I'm charging my phone right now while we're in this meeting.
Apologies for jumping in. This is Kevin with Our Energy Policy. We do want to move to audience questions just so we have enough time to get a few in. We have a significant number lined up here. So just opening it right up, we've had a few questions about barriers to greater adoption, from Joan Michelson and Mike Lubell. I'm going to paraphrase here, for panelists' thoughts. Which is the most significant technological choke point for transitioning to an all EV future? Batteries, secure and reliable grid or microgrid infrastructure, availability of raw materials, et cetera, and what policies or investments are needed to address that? We don't necessarily have to pick one of the off the list of the barrier you think is the most important to hear.
Frankly, all of the above, but from an automaker perspective, frankly, battery cost right now, and then you know, moving towards the future where we do get to significant scale, it will become about supply chain. So I think in the short term, it's about getting that cost down. But very quickly as we transition, as you reach those 30, 40, 50%, you know, penetration numbers, absolutely, you're going to start to run into some potential supply chain bottlenecks. I don't know what those are right now, right? Because they're a little further out in the future, and we don't know exactly what technologies are going to be there. But I think right now battery costs are the significant you know, barrier right now. But again, they're coming down, but they need to come down much further.
You know, I'll just echo Mike's comment here, and I think the supply chain points are the really critical one, because, you know, we see battery costs early days, but it's almost as if, you know, in the last, you know, call it 6 months, like the transition, it's not even in question anymore. And now it gets to the question of, can you build out the supply chain? And JB Straubel, Tesla's former CTO, put out, you know, an interesting comment. We see all these automakers putting out very large numbers on EV transition. Do the math on supply chain. And so I think that gets to why we've all of a sudden seen a slew of announcements on building battery plants. And, you know, as GM is doing, you know, bringing in cathode material, figuring out the recycling piece of this. Because I think the view is the entire industry would far rather sit on idle assets than be at a point where there's the demand, but you don't have the supply. And so, you know, more than anything else, one of the things I'm seeing just in all of the headlines of automakers is this increased, sharper focus on making sure every aspect of the supply chain is secured, because it's almost as if the demand for some of these products has been underappreciated.
Thank you very much for that. Moving on here, a question to the panelists. As far as to your knowledge, you know, how do the tax credits from federal and state governments work together? You know, do they work together? And how would we counter the argument that if the federal government is giving a tax credit, then the state government need not? That's from Nancy Najarian.
Do you think that question's more on the vehicle side or the infrastructure side, or both?
I think it's definitely a policy question here. Do you see a need for further tax credits? Do you think what's in the Build Back Better plan will become, you know, law, or is that too excessive? Just any thoughts you have on the issue?
Yeah, I guess we support what's in the Build Back Better program. I think you know, we're trying to focus on the customer, making EVs more affordable for them, and you know, federal versus state policies. We're a bit agnostic towards that. It's they can certainly work together. Some people have federal you know, tax liability, others have state tax liability. I think you know, looking at we would encourage anything that would make EVs at this point more affordable for consumers. Eventually, we will get to a point where incentives are not needed. We are not at that point yet, and frankly, we're in a point right now where it's an uneven playing field, where two companies don't enjoy the tax credit. The first movers in the industry that have sold the most EVs, and everybody else enjoys the tax credit. So we get to a level playing field, and we encourage anything that makes EVs more affordable for consumers.
I'll just tack on to that. Norway, we brought up that example earlier. Say, well, why is Norway 70 or 75% EV today? Well, in the early days of you know, Norway's EV policies, effectively the price of a Model S was equivalent to the price of a VW Passat. And so you want to say, why did Norway get to 75% EV penetration? It's with policies like that. So if the goal is to drive EV uptake, subsidies play a role.
Well, thank you for the answer. We've had a lot of questions come in. We didn't really talk too much about it during the discussion itself. I think it's pretty well summarized by the succinct question from Patrick Reinsborough. Does hydrogen fit into the e-mobility transition, or has it already lost the race to EVs?
Stephen, you want to try first, or you want me to?
Hey, sure. I mean, I would definitely wouldn't say losing the race is what we're talking about here, right? You know, we previously, right, already covered just sort of how this is a really wide stakeholder group that's going to be required to make these sort of changes, right? And I think folks involved both on the vehicle side, on the technology side, and on the fueling side are all still part of these conversations. I know hydrogen's a bit of a different animal, but I think it still does provide, I think, some useful solutions and some different angles that will continue to be explored. I don't think anyone is necessarily interested in in declaring any one of these technologies a winner, right? So it's definitely still, at least in my mind, still part of the technology set that is actively being looked at for many of these applications. And in some areas, definitely has a good or a competitive angle. So.
Yeah, just to add to that, there will be a role for hydrogen as an energy source. I think the extent of that role, the scale of that role is TBD. It's likely to be in more energy intensive applications. I mean, as we see it, I think that the market and the OEMs have kind of spoken, at least on the passenger vehicle side. But I think it's very much TBD as you get to more energy intensive applications. What I mean by that, class 5, 6, 7, 8, where the mass of the battery is starting to just be so large, and you're taking away payload to carry around battery for range of diminishing returns. Places like that, absolutely, hydrogen would potentially play a role. But again, as Stephen indicated, it's all TBD. But I think the other interesting thing with hydrogen is we not only have to find a role, we have to find a way to create it sustainably. So you have to also, there needs to be an equal focus, and I'm sure, Stephen, you'll agree on green hydrogen production, not just the use of hydrogen in transportation.
Thank you for that. We've also had a lot of questions about the build out of charging infrastructure. So an open question to the group here. We know from Tesla's supercharger and destination charger network that auto companies play a huge role in the buildup of charging infrastructure, but it can't just be a government initiative. So the question here is, to Colleen and Mike, what role do you see for your companies working with the government to build these networks out? What's been your experience so far, and what do you see down the road?
Yep. So I'll take that, and then Mike and Stephen can jump in. I think the role is really around the incentives and dropping the barriers to the deployment of infrastructure. So that is not just about wide availability of vehicles, but it also encourages things like I talked about earlier with clean fuels programs. We'd like to see a national standard there. But it's things like demand charge reform, as Mike mentioned, the incentives for the early movers who have generated widespread consumer appetite for their vehicles, enabling incentives for the infrastructure costs associated with charging, right? There's often a fair amount involved in trenching and construction, and the make ready can be significant expenditure for some of these site hosts, especially older construction. So we want to work together to influence all of it. And transportation is inherently local, right? So what one city needs looks very different than what another city needs. And so, we have to work at those local levels, municipalities, state level, federal, because we're just not quite at the point where it's all going to electric mobility. I'm increasingly hearing in my circles, well, my next vehicle will be an EV for those who are not driving electric yet. But the incentives are really critical, and that's across the board on utilities incentivizing the build out and infrastructure so they can be planful, new construction as well as existing build. So really, I think we're in a place where incentives are going to help us get to that next level of adoption.
Thank you for that. I believe we are out of time here. I'll be closing us out instead of Bill Squadron today. But before we do that, Mike, Stephen, any last thoughts to that question you'd like to add? All set.
Just real quick, Colleen's right. I think that the key phrase that you said, Colleen, there was transportation and charging inherently local. And it's really about you know, getting the chargers into the right places and not just along the highways. General Motors has a program where we're giving our dealers, our 4,000 dealers, each 10 chargers to install in their local community. You know, efforts like that are going to go a long way towards, again, that perceived ubiquity that Colleen's talked about. And so OEMs absolutely play a role. It's probably not efficient or great for the grid if every OEM builds their own proprietary charging network, though.
Thank you very much. Really do hate to draw this to a close. It's a very important conversation that is only becoming more important as we continue to push towards greater electrification in the sector. To that end, for anybody interested, we would strongly encourage you to check out the Our Energy library on our site, where you can find a lot more useful information, reports, technical papers, white papers, fact sheets about this transition. My colleague will drop a link to that in the chat here. So with that, sincere thank you to Dan, Michael, Stephen, Colleen, and of course our co-host Schiff Harden with Sarah Fitz in the opening remarks. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. Would also like to extend a thank you to our audience for joining us today for the last of our 2021 series. It's a very fantastic webinar to close out the year on. And of course, thank you again to our sponsors for supporting our energy policy, and we look forward to working with them next year on our next event series. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.